Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, the UK government's latest fiscal plans have thrown markets into turmoil and plunged the British pound. How can the new British government revive its economy? How are ordinary people affected? A fourth leak has been reported in the two Nord Stream gas pipelines linking Russia and Europe, raising suspicions of sabotage. What really happened, and how will the European energy market be affected? Now on Dialogue Weekend.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Xu Qinduo. The British pound plunged to a historic low against the US dollar this week with the newly announced tax cuts and a crisis of faith in the ability of the new British government to turn the economy around. What is the plan by the new government? What is the economy? Why the economy taking such a hit, and how will the nation be impacted? To find out, I'm joined by Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Professor Joav Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris, and Professor Iain Begg from London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome to the discussion. Iain, I will start with you. The crisis came after the largest tax cuts in over 50 years in the UK were announced by the finance minister, Mr. Kwasi Kwarteng, with the purpose to boost growth and create jobs. What's wrong with this plan?
Well, what's wrong with the plan is that it creates much more debt, and debt tends to drive up the interest rate. It will potentially also increase inflation by adding to demand at a time when there's relatively full employment in the UK economy. And the risk is that the Bank of England, as the custodian of interest rates, will be obliged as a result to raise interest rates even further than they would otherwise do to curb the additional inflation. A different way of looking at it is that if you imagine the authorities in charge of the British economy driving a car, one foot is on the accelerator, fiscal policy, and the other foot is on the brake pedal, which is monetary policy. And this creates huge tensions. You don't really know where the car is going to stagger when that happens.
Mm-hmm. Kinds of uncertainty. Professor Toker, the IMF criticized the policy, saying that it is important. Fiscal policy does not work at cross purposes to monetary policy. Similar criticism were also heard from, say, finance ministers of Spain, France, and Germany, as well as the US side. Also, Fed Reserve also expressed similar opinions. People in European mainland do see there's a problem with the plan, and what's their response? What's their comment?
Yes, the majority opinions are actually indicating that there is a problem. Now, just in order to contextualize, European economies and European governments were looking for some time at what the British are doing economically and raising questions about it regarding the proper wealth and well-being of Great Britain, regardless of what it may mean for German economy or French or Italian or Spanish one. So yes, there is a certain amount of difficulties on the continent in order to try and understand what the new Prime Minister is trying to do. Now, I have the feeling that something of the so-called Trump recipe, which freshly elected Donald Trump was trying to do with American economy towards the first year of his stay in office around the end of 2017, which actually was based on massive tax cuts and actually trying to put the wealthier components of the economy into full gear in the hope that whatever they'll be doing will be healing enough for other sectors of the economy. To some extent, it worked in America, although the British situation in this sense is somehow different from what the American economy was when Mr. Trump was doing what he was doing. And then the 4 or 5 years which have passed since Mr. Trump's massive intervention also lead to some questions. So the mystery stays, and the overall appreciation in Europe is that the British government would have to alter at least some of the measures it had declared upon because it would be too rough.
Mm-hmm. But Iain, Do you think the government under Mr. Truss is rethinking their plan because of the criticism or the pressure from other countries?
Well, they're facing attacks from three directions. One is from the markets, which are extremely skeptical about the economic strategy. And the result of that has been to drive up the price of British bonds and make it more expensive to borrow. Sorry, drive down the price of bonds, making the interest rate higher. And that means that there's a big risk to the UK public finances having to spend even more on servicing the debt than they already do. The second attack is coming from if you like, the mainstream economics establishment, and that includes the IMF and various other commentators saying that this is a very risky policy, which is not only going to give far too much benefit to the richer in the British society, but also is taking big risks because it's out of balance with monetary policy, as I indicated earlier. But the third concern, the one that's really going to make it very difficult for Liz Truss, is there's a lot of skepticism, even among her own party members and cabinet, saying what they've done has just gone too far compared with what was promising. In particular, a tax cut for the very richest, cutting the top rate from 45 to 40%, is seen as both unnecessary and very bad political optics, even though the amount concerned is not that great.
Mm-hmm. So it's there are multiple factors at working right now. John, if you look at economic theories, usually I guess the fiscal policies and monetary policies usually work together instead of going the opposite direction. Is that the case?
Yeah, well, I think what this plan reflects is basically, in my view, a reincarnation of Reagan economics, so-called supply-side trickle-down economics, and I hope that the tax cut will somehow feeds back to the economy and stimulates more investment and consumption. But the problem is, this is not a time to do something like this because, I think inflation is more problematic. Such a high number, above 8%, 9%, it's something that's politically unacceptable. So, this is a classic macroeconomics problem, the trade-off between stimulating the economy versus containing inflation. And I think clearly, the second objective should take the front seat right now. But I think the Truss administration is doing the exact opposite. Now, there's also another side of this problem in that the tax cut, as the previous guest has been saying, goes mostly towards the rich, which, it's not going to stimulate consumption too much because, the rich people, when they get a break in a tax bill, it's not going to be reflected in their consumption pattern. So I think the effect of the hope of this trickling down, whether it's going to happen now, remains a big question. I don't think it's going to trickle down anytime soon. There's tons of problem at this point. And I think, as Larry Summers has been saying, it's a very naive plan. I'm very skeptical whether the original objective of this plan is going to be achieved in the end.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ian, interestingly, some economists are attributing the crisis, linking the crisis, with the Brexit. They say, like FTP is saying that the European capitals believe UK government's tax-cutting, high borrowing plan exposes flawed thinking that drove Brexit. Is that the case? Do people think?
Well, Brexit is a contributor, but I would say a relatively minor one because it means that some consumer prices, particularly foodstuffs coming from other European countries, are a little bit more expensive than they would otherwise be. But the primary source of the inflation is, as we all know, the rise in energy prices and the knock-on effects that has. Britain is now paying more for things that would otherwise be able to import from the European Union relatively easily. That adds a little bit to inflation, but it's not a fundamental factor. Instead, what I think you see going on here is that the whole economic model that Truss has come in with is outside the mainstream. It's taking big risks. In short, it's a gamble. She should maybe visit Macau rather than stay in the UK.
Well, Professor Toker, there's pieces like in the UK, in the FT carried that they are talking about this thinking behind the leadership in the UK. Basically, you have this Reaganomics, but you don't have a powerful dollar supporting your policy. And also, when they look at the EU like an adversary negotiator, probably they are thinking about going back to greatness or back to the empire. That kind of assumption, does that have something to do with the decision making in terms of the new government?
Well, we know that right after British Brexit, and as the British accompanied the real process of Brexit, there was that idea of global Britain, which would compensate for the advantages the British economy and gained from the European association with continental Europe, but also we look up in a more modernized way to the entire globe as the source of strength and potentiality in economics. We know that under Prime Minister Johnson, the plans sounded very promising. The rhetorics were climbing up and up, but realities and figures did not follow. So together with other fragilizing elements which the British economy had punched over the last few years, comes now, indeed, as my colleague in London mentioned very rightly, the elements which are the short-run ones, namely the price of energy and the fact that this could not be compensated, but by what the ex-European partners could have been of help if the British were still part of the EU. So altogether, that actually adds up to the analysis we, all of us, actually expressed, that it's awkward. It's a gamble, said my colleague. I don't know whether the British then should go to Macau, of all places, in order to materialize this gamble, but it's a very risky operation.
Risky operation. Well, if it's very risky, Iain, briefly, what is the political impact? People are talking about the recent survey by YouGov. Obviously, the Labour is can we say far ahead of the Tory? I mean, the Conservatives are very much concerned.
Yes, it's been a very welcome gift to the Labour Party, who can now portray themselves as the party of economic competence when they see what's going on by this new Truss government. And I think as well that there's going to be a lot of pressure on Truss, who came in or campaigned on the stance that she was going to lionize markets, help markets to function well. The first thing she does is a massive intervention in the market, namely the imposing the cap on energy prices. And the second thing she did is completely to fail to understand how markets work in relation to what's happened in the gilts markets, the bond market. So she's in trouble, big trouble.
She's in trouble. Let's move on to some places closer, not far away from Europe here. A fourth leak has been discovered along the two Nord Stream pipelines running from Russia to Germany following underwater blasts earlier this week. What caused the leaks and how is the investigation progressing, and how consequential are those explosions if a state actor was involved? For this part, we are also joined by Mark Sleboda, Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst. Mark, welcome to the show. How certain we are right now at this point, these explosions were caused by an attack, not by natural causes?
I think that the consensus across the board, whether we're talking Western countries or Russia, is that this was an attack. I don't believe that there's anyone seriously propositioning the forward that in three different pipelines there were four different major ruptures when seismologists in both Denmark and Sweden recorded large spikes that they attribute to explosions the size of 500 kilograms of TNT.
Well, a former Polish defense minister has expressed thanks to the U.S. After the explosion on Twitter. So is Washington behind the explosions? Both Joe Biden, the president of the U.S., and also his senior official Victoria Nuland, threatened basically to derail Nord Stream 2 one way or the other. Let's take a look.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Well, John, obviously, the U.S. said that they were not aware of this. They basically knew nothing about the explosions. They were finger pointing. They are pointing Russia, and many also are pointing to Washington. Washington, we don't know, what really happened. Nobody knows, probably. So, what do you make of the case right now?
Well, for something like this, such a large damage, just even talking about the existing gas in these two pipelines are worth reportedly somewhere between $600 to $800 million. It's hard to imagine that Russia would be doing something like this if all the reasons that have been proposed so far, and you think about the cost of doing this, it's just unimaginable. I mean, Russia owns 51% of the equity stake of the company that runs these two pipelines. Now, who is behind this? And I think we have to look at the motives. There will be investigations, and it may take some time for the truth to come out. But I think at least at this moment, it's a legitimate question to ask who is most to gain from doing something like this. And I think it's pretty clear that several countries might be very interested in doing this, including the United States, including Ukraine, and I might also venture to put Poland on the table as well. It's interesting to see that so far I haven't seen any European media saying that it's Russia doing this. I mean, most of the accusations are coming from the United States as well as U.S. media quoting anonymous sources within Europe, which are described as European leadership. It turns out to be some environmental officials in the European Union who are anonymous, and who knows who these people are, being quoted in the U.S. media, for example, in CNN, in Washington Post, that's actually accusing Russia of doing this. And none of the European media that I've seen, any European country, any European official, named European official, has been come out and been saying that it's been Russia doing this. So I think that tells volume about who is actually behind this. But I'm not going to jump to a conclusion. I'm totally open. I think it may take some time for the investigation to take place, and even if the United States is involved in this, I think ultimately it will be disclosed. I mean, look at the historical precedents. Remember, during the Reagan administration, Oliver North was involved in the Iran-Contra thing. It eventually came out. It's a democratic society, and I think it's kind of difficult to keep a secret forever. So I'm not going to rush to a conclusion. Give it some more time, and I think the truth will come out.
Professor Toker, the accusation from German intelligence agencies saying that, quote, only Russia can really be considered for this, especially since it stands to gain the most from this act of sabotage. What's the public response to the latest instance there? And do people somehow, probably presume that's the Russian act or Russian explosion?
Well, many presume, but the way they presume is based, after all, on hypotheses and lecturing of the situation, which do have some rationale element. Now, of course, I don't know who was there with the bombs or the submarines or the special commandos. It is clear that it had to be a state. And then if you stay with these two options, either the Russians or the Americans, I would also tend to think that these are the Russians. I would place it on a larger level of lecture. I would say that President Putin, and not starting yesterday, the day before yesterday, with the attacks of the gas of the pipelines, but for months now has placed himself and his country away from, beyond, and in a way out of the international order, by invading a sovereign country, by operating these last days the strange referendum procedure, which is going to be followed by a formal annexation of the 4 separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. President Putin, facing a military situation on the terrain which he cannot master, which he cannot win, at least not in the short or the medium run.
Professor Toker, there's
be
little
looking
reason
for other
to bomb
ways.
their own pipeline. Why does Putin bomb their own pipeline?
Precisely because it has an absurd, a paradoxical meaning, which would actually signal to the West, to the Europeans, to others, that we Russians in this situation are ready to go very, very far. And which means more precisely through the attack of the pipelines.
Let me have Mark. Mark, what's the public response in Moscow, in Russia, when they see this accusation from Germany, from Washington? It's Russia. It's justified for Russia to do this.
I don't think there's any surprise. If you get your news from the Western mainstream media and commentariat, the people of East Ukraine, the so-called pro-Russian separatists, quote unquote, have been shelling themselves for the last 8 years. According to the Western mainstream media, Russian forces have been shelling themselves in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant for the last 3 months, attempting to detonate themselves in a nuclear explosion. So why wouldn't Putin blow up his own $30 billion pipeline, which was his main source of political economic leverage over European countries? I mean, even the people proposing this, they don't believe this. They know it was the United States. We all know it was the United States. They're simply gaslighting the world because of the implications of admitting that their own hegemonic master, that the European client states can't bring themselves to admit the lengths that the U.S. would go to. They had already sanctioned Nord Stream 2, not only Russian companies, but European countries in an attempt to make sure that it was never completed. We have heard from the U.S. president himself, his State Department officials, that they would bring an end to this pipeline one way or another. Well, now they have, and now they're just laughing at everyone. No one seriously believes this. There's certainly the viewership of CGTN is not stupid enough to believe these absurd.
Let me have Iain. Iain, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, said after the leaks, after the explosion, he thought the leaks would not have a significant impact on Europe's energy reliance. Do you think there will be the impact, the consequences for the European energy security or the supply of energy?
Well, there are two things that we've been missing in this discussion so far. One is that Nord Stream 2 was built but never opened. Nord Stream 1 had been closed down by the Russians relatively recently, and even before that had been pumping only at 20% capacity probably as a way of exerting pressure on Germany. So in this sense, Germany, above all, has already been racing to find alternative sources of supply and has been relatively successful in doing so. Yes, they would love it if Nord Stream 1 was still pumping, but I think the signal coming from the Russians had been, don't expect this to happen anytime soon. And the second thing that maybe is arisen in the European debate is that whoever did this, and I have no means of knowing whether it's Russians, Poles, or Ukrainians, or Americans, at least sends a signal to the rest of the world that you have pipelines. There's a pipeline between Algeria and Europe. There's a pipeline between Norway and the United Kingdom. You need to think about how vulnerable your gas supply sources are if somebody gets more hostile than they have been. You don't need something like nuclear weapons or chemical weapons to do a huge amount of damage going beyond conventional warfare. So I think we should bring that element into the debate as well.
So,
Well,
just
John, go
pipelines
ahead.
for gas,
So
but also undersea cables.
this argument is based on the basis that you have to shoot your own feet to demonstrate to the other side that you also have a feet. This argument doesn't make any sense at all. If you have to make a statement like this, you don't have to blow up 2 pipelines, right? I mean, it will be enough to blow up just 1 pipeline. The other pipeline's never been in operation at all. Why would you blow up 2 pipelines to demonstrate to the other side that you have pipelines too? I mean, the argument that you blow up your own pipelines to make a point that you also have pipelines, it's just so absurd to me.
But then, John, here's the issue. Many people have this fear if in this energy disruption, more than that, geopolitical energy crisis, because it has a geopolitical factor here. And we don't know what's the bottom line. If some state could manage to do this and without the consequences, because we will not be able to know the causes until maybe 50 years later. What about the safety or security of other projects? For example, undersea cables or other important infrastructure projects.
Well, for that, you can, the Russians could have done many things. They could have blown up the undersea cables in the Black Sea leading to Ukraine. That's the easiest way to demonstrate to the rest of the world that these are assets that can be subject to attack. It doesn't have to attack your own assets to make that point, right? Now, another thing I want to point out is that by doing this, it doesn't really alter the energy supply situation in Europe at all. Because they've already shut it down. They pretty much shut it down, and they can keep shutting it down. You don't have to blow it up to keep that situation. So, all the arguments I have heard, it just doesn't make sense at all. I mean, there's a very far-stretched arguments, hand-waving arguments that don't hold water at all.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, I mean, is this idea ever thinkable for Europeans that the Americans might have done that, even though they are allies of the Europeans, but something they have done? Is that probably unthinkable for people? People would never think of that.
Yeah, I agree.
But it could be
geopolitics, especially. I agree that it's unthinkable and very, very out of scope. However, when you are into the business of geopolitics and you're going through a period which is under numerous tensions, you can't just exclude it by definition from any scenarization of the situation. I still think that most indication through that analysis and following the larger rationale of who's doing what would actually tend to what I was trying to say a few minutes ago, that it's sort of a signaling, and which deals not only with energy supplies, but also with other infrastructures such as cables, which carry the internet, which carry telephone communication, even water to some extent.
Right.
And the one who could be benefiting from that in this short run, because Putin's problem is the short run. It's not the idea. It's the situation of the European energy market in a year from now or in 5 years from now. He has to get out of a difficult situation he has drawn himself and his country into over the last 7 months.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.